Hello everyone, my name is Kronslav Stifter and welcome to Editorial Retouch from start to finish, part 11. Can you imagine we're part 11 already? And happy Halloween. I think today is Halloween and I wanted to add some creepy crawlers in the video, but my editing wasn't so good today, so sorry about that. And also, if you like this video, please give it a like. As always, share it with your friends because the more people see this, the more I can make, and I think that benefits everybody. And of course, if you like to receive some give me some comments, that would be great because then I have a sense of what I'm doing right or wrong, or how much you appreciate this. It can be also very motivating. And of course, if you like to receive more from me and these type of videos, please subscribe to my channel and you will receive updates as soon as they're ready. So let's get started. Alright, let's talk about some of the things we still haven't talked about. For one thing, we have retouched at this point all three images, and I showed you how I match colors, how I match the colors in my workflow, in Camera Raw and all that. Well, there are still a few things left, mainly the finishing touches, the sharpening, the cropping and things like that, as well as saving in what format, what color profile to use and things of that nature. So in this episode, we're gonna take a look at that. For one thing, the straight horizon line, mainly in this image. If you remember in one of the episodes at the beginning, I believe it was episode number 3, I asked you that I wasn't sure whether or not this horizon line should stay the way it is. And some of you commented that, yeah, it's okay to stay because there is a horizon, there is a vertical line on his nose, and it kind of makes sense that he's straight. The horizon line might be okay for this. Some mentioned Dutch tilt, which I'm not sure it's really in this case, but it certainly can work if it's tilted, I think, to a certain point. Some others said no, it shouldn't work. Well, either way, I'm okay with leaving it, and I'm also okay with straightening it out. And if we compare all three images together, if you imagine that this is in some kind of a magazine, then yeah, it would almost make sense to make this straight to match the other image. So from those point of view, whether you want to make it straight or not, it doesn't really matter. In this case, I'm going to straighten it out because I want to show you the part about that. If you do have to in your images do the same thing. So what I'll do is I'll grab my crop tool. I'll take my straighten tool here and I'm going to drag it across what I think should be straight. And when I let go, it's going to give me a suggested crop. Now I don't want to cut off his fingers, so I'll just make it a little bit bigger, and I'm going to reduce it here so that this line kind of covers his eyes slightly, like so perhaps. And let's say this is my final version, so I'm going to click OK. Also, I'm not going to check delete crop pixels because maybe I want to revert that. So I'm going to click to accept, and it's going to do its processing thing. Now, because we have so many layers in Smart Object, it might take him a little while to convert the colors and match everything. After it was cropped, it has to re-render everything. Once that is done, we will have to extend the background slightly. So in this case, well, we have no problems here. The only thing that we have is this area here. So how would you do that? You can try the content aware fill, but I already tried that and it doesn't really work that well. So instead, here's what I'll do. I'll grab my magic wand tool. I'm going to click on this area to select it, but I want to expand it slightly. So I'll go to select, modify, expand, and let's expand it, let's say 25 to about this area, right? So that we don't go all the way to the edge, because there was some kind of a darker edge there. And then I'm going to take my selection tool and move this selection, move this selection to about this area here. And now I'm going to switch to the content aware move tool. Now this is pretty cool if you're using newer versions of Photoshop. If not, you might have to manually clone something like this. And I'm going to make sure that it says extend. So now I'm going to merge everything to its own new layers. So that will be Command, Shift, Alt, and E, or if you're on PC, Control, Shift, Alt, and E. and so I can actually work with, because there's no sample all. Actually it has sample all layers, but now let me try that. If I click a blank layer, let's see if it's gonna work. It might work. So I'm gonna drag it down there and I'm gonna release it. It's gonna apply it, and let's see how it worked. Well, it did a pretty decent job, right? We still have a line here we need to fix, but I mean it did a pretty decent job. So I'm gonna create a new blank layer. I'm gonna grab my my other tool. In this case, I'm gonna make sure that hardness is set to 0. My clone tool is selected. I'm gonna sample here and just kind of go over it, maybe with a little bit of a smaller brush, because it's gonna look less like repeating lines. If I have anything that I'm cloning, so that I can see the pattern, I'm gonna have to fix that manually, like so. And this is how you would, pretty much fix anything. So let's just go over this one more time. And I'm just trying to make sure that we don't have any visible, noticeable repeating lines or patterns. You don't have to make it perfect, but just enough so that it works for you. Now, once we have this, let's see. Yeah, I still have some repeating lines here, so I'm gonna just kind of loosely paint so we don't have those problems. If I see something that's repeating, I'm gonna reduce that. And here we have a new version of the file. Now there is another problem. You see this? We have like a repeating line, but I don't want to clone or heal. I'm gonna lose the texture. I just want to change the shadows and highlights. So this is a job for, of course, dodging and burning. So let's click on our action. You already know this. Soft light, gray layer. You can do this with any kind of dodge and burn method you like. And I'm just going to lighten this to change so that maintains the original texture. It's just gonna look differently in terms of shadows and highlights, which is exactly what we do with skin, right? But here it's not a skin, it's another type of texture. The principle is the same, it's just a different part of an image. So let's see. So this is before and after, before and after. Nicely kind of we don't see as much of a repeating pattern now. Is there anything else here that we have to worry about? Yeah, maybe I can fix this area. So I'm going to create a new blank layer on top of this one, grab my clone tool again and just paint over this area to match it. And as you can see, it's very easy to fix elements. If you see anything else you need fixing, here is an area where we could just do some more cloning, and that's how I would fix just about anything. So now that I have this, let's call this in a new group, let's call this crop. Crop correction, just so I know. Okay, so we've done this. Now the other part of the problem here is sharpening. Now here maybe it wouldn't be so really visible as in this image, if you remember. So let me show you in this image the problem with sharpening. So obviously we have to also apply some kind of sharpening, and if you noticed, if you have been following this series, I haven't applied any sharpening yet. The reason I didn't do that is because I only care about at this point about output sharpening. So let's examine different versions of sharpening first. So there are three basic types of sharpening, or we can categorize them in three basic ways. So first one would be, of course, the input sharpening, and the idea is to compensate for the fact that cameras make our images slightly less sharpened than we might like. Now this is something that you may or may not use. We'll talk about this in a second in a more practical terms. Then there is creative sharpening. This could be just for creative effect, for some kind of impact on the viewer. It may not be anything technically, how to produce a technically perfect image, more like an effect that you create for the emotional impact of the audience. And finally, we have output sharpening. Output sharpening is, again, a way to compensate for the fact that if we print or if we post on web, we might lose slightly in our sharpening of the image, so we want to compensate for that. Now, when you're retouching the way I do, sometimes you may not want to follow the conventional rules, and that's what I wanted to show you. Alright, so let's talk about input sharpening first. Let me go back in history a little bit and go back when we actually worked with raw files. So I'll just open up one of the smart objects because it's so easy to go back now, right? And let's talk about sharpening here, because this is the first time you would open up a raw file and you would tamper with your sharpening. So I'll go to my sharpening tab, and what you'll see is that my sharpening here is set to 0. I have activated this by choice. So if I zoom to, let's say, 100%, and let me maybe position myself here, what you will notice is that the image looks decently sharp to begin with, because the camera was pretty good. Now if I increase this to the amount that it was by default, which was about 25 if I'm not mistaken, the image still looks good. It's not of a, it's not that big of a change, but the problem is that if I applied sharpening here, especially when I need to do detail work like cloning or healing or dodging and burning, I'm actually giving myself a lot, let me repeat that, a lot more work, which I may not want to. So my suggestion is, when you have an image that is decently sharp, the one we have here for example, and you are planning to do healing, cloning, dodging and burning, those kind of precise edits, I would suggest you reduce the sharpening all the way to the 0 and you leave it there. Now the image will still look very sharp because, as you can see, we still have all the details. It's not big of a deal, and yet we have a lot less work now when we start cleaning, healing, dodging and burning and all that. Where if I were to increase the sharpening, especially if I were to increase it even more than default, I would have to worry about all the little patterns and stuff. It just gives me a lot more work than I would have to. So that is what I would recommend, to reduce sharpening in your camera raw or whatever raw converter you have, as long as you have a sharp enough image to begin with, which it should be. And if you're planning to do very precise type edits, then make your job easier, reduce the sharpening. However, let's talk about what we get here. Well, there's also an idea of so-called creative sharpening, right? And the idea is to create some kind of an emotional effect. Now here we don't have this situation because that's not the nature of the image, but sometimes you might want to apply this. So let's say I wanted to sharpen the background for some reason, right? Well, I could click on one of our masks. Let's click on the mask, and I'm gonna merge everything to its own new layer, like so. And I might go to create a mask for this. I want a reverse mask, so I'll Control Command I, so it will only affect the background. Let's say I want to apply the background. I'm going to use here any number of methods you can use. I'm going to use the high pass method just for the sake of being different. Filter, other, high pass, and I'm going to apply some maybe 10 pixels or something like that, or maybe even more, maybe like something like this, right? 36. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to set this to, I don't know, soft light. And let's look at the background, before and after, before and after. Of course, I got all the halos around the models, which I don't like, but this would be an example of a creative effect. Or if I wanted to reverse this and make them more sharp, I could do that as well by inverting the mask. So this would be maybe a creative effect. In our case, it's definitely something we don't want, but there are situations when you might see that very crunchy type look, or some people call it HDR look, right? Well, that would be a good example of creative sharpening. However, for our purposes, we don't need that. So what is left is the output sharpening, and that's the one I was preparing for you to see, because that's the one that, again, I leave for the end. And the reason why I leave it for the end, well, let me give you an example. So this is now a retouched, actually let me go to 66% so you can see more of the area. So this was before the cleanup and everything, if you remember, right? Now can you imagine if this was really sharp, how much more I would have to retouch this? In fact, let me show you. Let me apply a little bit of sharpening. Let's go to sharpen, unsharp mask, and let's apply a bit of sharpening here so you'll see what I mean. Now look how much more grunchy that is. I'm not sure how much you can see this in your video because this is compressed YouTube video, but look how much more crunchy that is. So if you had to dodge and burn and clean and heal, you would have to do a lot more work. But if I do it with a little bit less sharp image like we saw there, because I didn't apply any input sharpening, and I do all my cleanup as we see here, now after everything has been cleaned up, everything is fine. Now if I apply sharpening, it's gonna make the perfect skin that much more sharper, and that's the effect we were going for, right? So let's do that. So how do you do this? Well, there are pretty much any method you can think of. We can use the high pass, we can use the unsharp mask, we can use smart sharpen, you can use an external third-party plugin, you can use just about anything you can imagine. I personally like to use, since Photoshop CC, I like to use their Camera Raw plugin. That one works for me best because it has so many options. So here's how I would do it. So if you're using Photoshop or Photoshop CC or Photoshop CC and whatever update happens after that, you will have an option to merge everything to its own new layer. So you remember the keyboard shortcut, Control Shift Alt and E, and then you can actually apply a Camera Raw filter to pretty much any layer. And on top of that, you can also apply it as a smart filter. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to go to Filter, Convert for Smart Filters, and then I'm going to go to Filters and Camera Raw Filter. When I click on this, it's going to open it up inside of Camera Raw user interface with all the options, except this is now treated as a JPEG or a TIFF. It's not a RAW file. There is no options for RAW, and there are some other options here that we're missing. But the majority of the functions that we have left will allow us to apply sharpening and things like that, or we could, play around with all these sliders, no problem, just like before, except it's not a raw file. So what I'll do is I'll zoom to a 100%, or maybe not 100%, but let's say 50%, so I can see what I'm doing, and I'll click on this detail tab. Now there's a warning sign that says, for a more accurate preview, zoom the preview size to 100% or larger when adjusting the controls in the panel. Unfortunately, if I zoom to 100%, maybe I won't see perfectly what I want to do, but we can try. So it has sharpening and noise reduction sections here. We're going to focus on sharpening here. It has 4 sliders: amount, radius, detail, and masking. Now, amount, of course, decides how much of sharpening in terms of amount do you want to apply. It's almost like in percentages or so. And then of course radius decides how many pixels do you want to, 2 neighboring pixels, how much do you want to affect. And we have our radius option, and we have our detail option and masking. Detail basically tries to attack all the little details, the high frequency inside the image. And masking tries to protect everything except the edges. And it works pretty well. Let me show you. So since we have a very clean skin, which has been retouched at this point, we don't have to worry as much of bringing in all the bad stuff as well. And that's the beauty of doing this at the end. Remember, I said that as far as input sharpening, we reduce it to 0, so we don't have to spend too much time dodging and burning and all that. And then at the end, when everything is cleaned already, then when we increase the sharpening, we're going to increase the sharpening of retouched skin and whatever else we have here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase sharpening. Let's make it to about 30. And for radius, I'm going to leave it to 1% here. Detail, you can stay at 25 for this image. And now I want to show you the masking. So for masking, I'll go to about 50% so you can see better. And here's the thing, when you hold down your Alt or Option key and you drag these sliders, two things happen. When you drag in the amount, you get black and white preview, which basically gives you a better sense. Since you're not sharpening the color, you're sharpening the tones, it kind of takes away the color distraction for you. So I can see better what I'm doing. And let's put it to 30 amount. Now for radius, you can actually see when I hold down my Alt or Option key, or maybe when I zoom to 100%, you'll see it even better. If I drag my radius, you can see how I'm actually increasing the radius of those pixels. Let's leave it at 1% here. Now detail, if I drag that one, you can see how I'm increasing just the high frequency details here, right? So let's leave it about 30 or so. And this is the one I really like. It creates an edge mask on the fly. Let me show you the masking slider. If I hold down my Alt or Option key for this one, here's what happens. Now remember the masking principles, right? White reveals, black conceals. So anything that's white, that's where the effect will apply. Anything that's not white, that's black, that's where we will hide the effect of sharpening here. So as you can see, if I'm drag this, I can actually only affect the edges without affecting the skin. And I want to affect it, but not that much. So maybe about 30 might work. So let's zoom to 100% and let's see before and after. Before and after. You can barely see this because you're watching this on a compressed video on YouTube. So I'll increase this more than I would normally like to. So I'll increase this to, I don't know, maybe even 60. Let's see before and after. Before and after. I don't know if you can see this. Before and after. Right, so maybe I can even increase the radius here slightly to about 1.8 and then reduce the details because I don't want it too much details to get crunchy. And let's see this before and after. Before and after. You can start to get a sense of the sharpening right applied. Now hopefully you can see this on your video. So let's look at this area. Before and after. Before and after. I'm getting more of that area. Maybe if I increase the radius here to about 1, I'm not going to get as much crunchy stuff. Yeah, so not sure how much you can see this on your video, but it should be okay. Now that's something I would apply. Play around with these sliders. And once I'm done, I would click OK. And this is now applied on its own new layer, and it's in Camera Raw filter. So if I double click on it, I can then open it up inside of Camera Raw once again. If I wanted to not, if I only wanted to affect luminance, it used to be that you would set the layer to luminosity, but you can also do it here. But if I double click on this icon, I can also change the blend modes, and I can change the opacity. I'm going to change it to luminosity. This is not a mandatory step. What it does, it will now not try to, it won't look like I'm sharpening the color problems, only the luminance. So if I have any color noise or stuff, it wouldn't be as much affected. And that's pretty much it. That will be my version of sharpening. Now of course, if you're in ideal position, you would print this image and see how the colors will hold up, how the sharpening will hold up. If you're not in a perfect position, as many of us are not, then you would have to kind of try to guess what might be a good option for you based on trial and error mostly and some experience. Now when it comes to sharpening for print, depending on what kind of print you do and all that, but typically you want to apply a little bit more sharpening than you're comfortable on screen. And some of that will be softened in the printing process, and you'll get just the right amount of sharpening at the end when it's printed. And that's what I would apply. Now if you're saving this for web, then I have another method, and I'll show you that in a later part of this video. So let's go and talk about, this was sharpening applied to print, right? Not for the web yet. So another thing I want to talk about is preparing the image for printing in terms of color. So let's talk about that. If I click on one of these images inside of Bridge, I'll get a bunch of stuff about metadata that's within the image telling me what I'm starting with. And this is pretty straightforward, right? Now, what about the output? Well, we need to know what the output will be, and most of the time it will be print and web. Sometimes it will be just print, sometimes it will be just web. But most of the time, in my experience, if you're working this professionally, you're gonna do both, print and web. It is a good idea if you know what your output will be. Sometimes you will have that luxury, sometimes you will not. We will have that luxury, so I'm going to show you something, and it's going to be partly universal, partly specific to my case. But let me show you that if you know your output and you know your input, then you can determine the optimal working settings for your workflow. So let's take a real quick an overview of what we're going to be working with. So we have our file type and everything else we've seen in Bridge according to our raw file, right? We have our input, we have our working flow, working settings and output settings. Input settings is what we know, output settings is what we know, so based off of that we're going to determine working settings. Ideally, input settings you will always have because you will just open up a raw file and see what those are. Working settings usually at this point are going to be not sure, and output settings as well. Once you know the output settings, in our case, the output settings are going to be for print, I always deliver in TIFF. For web, I always deliver in JPEG. And that's pretty much what I always use. So that stays same for you and for me. Now, as far as pixel dimensions, original size is usually enough for print, more than enough pixels, 300 ppi for print, and on the shorter end, 1000 to 500 pixel for web usually works fine. The bit depth always delivers in 8 bits per channel for print and for web as well. And what we're left is the color profile. Now, in my case, I'll be delivering to prepress here in Europe, so it's going to be foreground 27 or 39, and for web, it's always sRGB. Once you have those, then you can determine the working settings. You start with RAW, and then you either save in PSD or TIFF for your layers. I'll show you which one I choose and why. And then we also have for pixel dimensions, well, basically use whatever you have, maybe you crop it, but that's more than enough for good print, as we have seen. We did some cropping, but nothing really that major. We still have more than enough. And as far as working settings, well, I showed you why I work in 8-bit. Sometimes you might work in 16-bit. In my case, I work with 8-bit. And of course, finally, we have the color profile. And either you can work in Adobe RGB or ECI RGB, as I already mentioned. So that's how you would determine the working settings once you know the input and output. So once you know all those settings, then you can decide whether or not, how are you going to approach working with this image so you preserve most of the data in your image as possible. Here we have a image that's in RAW, right? So let me open it up in Camera Raw, and here of course at the bottom we have an option to choose our workflow settings. If I click on that, it's going to tell me, okay, how do I process this image to be opened up in Photoshop? You saw me open that up here in ECI and in 8-bit. Some of you actually asked me about this, so I'm going to give you a brief explanation. Why I chose 8-bit, I'll link you to a video which explains it why. In our case, we had a lot of raw conversions, and it was enough to work with 8-bit without having any posterization or any kind of other issues. As far as ECI RGB, I use that for two reasons. One is because I'm going to be printing here in Europe, so it's going to be either 4 or 39 probably on prepress, and I think that ECR is more of an optimal choice for this area. If you're in North America, most likely you'll use Adobe RGB. They're both fine, especially for this image. However, if you're using Camera Raw older than, I'm not sure which version, maybe even Camera Raw 7 and earlier than that, you will only have options to choose between these four options: Adobe RGB, Color Match, ProPhoto, and sRGB. All of these others will not be available to you. So if you're using a newer version, then you can actually choose ECI here, if this is what you'll be using. I'll explain in a minute why I chose one over the other and when. But in this particular case, even if you choose Adobe RGB or ECI, you will be fine. 8-bit or 16-bit, that will depend on kind of image you're working with, and that's pretty much it. Once you're done, you would click OK, and then you can click Open Object or whatever you want to start working inside of Photoshop. So let's go back there and see what we would do after that stage. Alright, so you processed your image as a raw file, you opened it up inside of Photoshop and you're about to do your layers and everything else, right? So in this case, you can't save it without layers. It wouldn't make a lot of sense unless you're doing something really simple. So when you're working with layers and all that, how do you save it? Well, I'll go to File, Save As, and I'm gonna save this one with TIFF options. And let's just name it something else here, because I want to show you the TIFF options. Now you can choose between Photoshop, Format, and TIFF. So which one do you want to use? Well, I personally almost always used PSD. However, recently I started using TIFF, and it seems that has a bit more advantages. And I'll show you in a minute what those advantages are. But if you choose Photoshop, then it's pretty straightforward. You would activate, ICC profile, thumbnails, alpha channels, layers, and you would save it. For TIFF options, you would leave everything as it is. Now, when you click Save, it's going to give you this other option, TIFF options. So here you can choose between different options, depending on your needs. For example, under image compression, if you choose none, it's not going to apply any compression, which is pretty cool, right? Now, if you do apply compression, you can choose between two different compressions here, and both of those are lossless compressions, which means that you don't lose any data, it just saves the file in a different way. It's kind of like, well, imagine you have a suitcase and you're getting ready to go for a trip, right? You can take all your stuff and really loosely throw it in that trunk, and it's going to be very easy to fill the trunk, and you're going to have a hard time putting a lot of stuff inside. It's going to be full very soon. But if you spend your time to carefully manage everything within the trunk and put it in its place, in the same trunk, in the same space, you can put a lot more stuff. But it's going to take you more time to pack everything, right? So the same thing is true for lossless compression. It takes more time to to encode and decode the file to open and save it, but it does reduce the file size without losing the data. Same is true for zip and LZV. When you click on zip, it's going to give you a warning sign, probably is not supported by older TIFF readers. Now, I don't think that's a problem because that's kind of really like a legacy feature. So whether you use zip or LZV doesn't matter. You can experiment and see which one gives you better options. You can also, in some cases, if you don't have any layers, choose a JPEG option and actually save it as a JPEG. Now here I would use all the default settings for these two, and under layer compression we do have layers, and TIFF does support layers. So here you can choose faster saves, bigger files, slower saves, smaller files, or discard layers and save a copy. It's pretty self-explanatory. I typically use zip option, and this is how I would click save. However, if you're using a PSD to save the file, there's another option I want to show you. So I'll go to Edit, I'll go to Preferences, and I'll go to General, and here under File Handling, I typically like to use this. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. I typically choose this to Ask. What this will do is it will save the file as a layered file, and then it will put basically another JPEG file to be read by other programs so that you can actually see what the layer file looks like. So whatever was visible, it will stack it at the end and save it as a kind of like a JPEG preview. If you save it to never, it's never going to save it. If you save it to always, it's always going to save you that preview. Makes the file a little bit bigger, but it's more compatible with other programs from Lightroom to everything else. I choose it to Ask, which is by default. Reason is that if I now go to File, Save As, and I choose to save this as a Photoshop file, and I click Save, it's going to give me the warning sign, Maximize Compatibility. And I always use this, but I like the fact that it shows me this dialog box because it's almost like a additional warning sign, like, are you sure you want to save this? Right? So I use it as a warning sign, as a reminder. Not necessarily, I almost always use this Maximize Compatibility option. So that's how you can save with either TIFF or PSD. Now let's take a look which one is better and why. So which one should you use, PSD files or TIFFs for saving? I think both are very fine, but here's basically the difference between them. When it comes to TIFF files and PSDs, they both support alpha channels, layers, 16 bits per channel, lab and grayscale data, masks, everything. And the same is true for PSD. So as far as worrying about your channels, smart objects, everything, you don't have to worry. They're identical. When it comes to limit, well, both of these files have a limit of 30,000 pixels total inside of a file. The way they differ, however, is the maximum document size of TIFF is 4 gigabytes, and for PSD it's 2 gigabytes. So if you have a very large file, you might decide to go with the TIFF file. And if even that is not enough, there's also another option. If you need to work with large files then what both PSD and TIFF support, then Photoshop offers a large document format called PSB that supports all Photoshop features, but it doesn't really have any other limits. It's really huge. So that's another option. So now you know what I've done, right? I've chosen for this one I use TIFF. I set it in an 8-bit per channel mode. I explained that why. And what we have left here is ECI and soft proofing. Okay, so we know this will go to web and print. Web is less problem, more about print. Ideally, you would know what your print output will be, and ideally you would do your actual test print so you know what's going on. Sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you don't know who your output will be, and you don't have an option to do a test print because it's in a different country, or you don't know the output, or you don't have the budget, whatever the case. So you got to work with what you have. So let me give you a few kind of constructive suggestions that you might try. So let's say that we know that this image will be printed in Europe, and I know that certain prepress here would print in 439. So I have at least that. Now I have a calibrated monitor and I have an IPS panel, and this is something I talked about at the beginning, episode 1, if you remember. And there I talked about how you can choose. If you have a proper monitor, properly calibrated, then you can try to simulate, soft proof your image. Soft proofing, in case you don't know, is a process of simulating on screen how your image might look when printed on a particular device. In our case, let's see how this might look. So I'll just move this away, this interface, and I'll go to View and Proof Setup, and I'll click Custom. Now I will be printing this on 439 prepress, so I already know that. And if you're in North America, this might be different, or if you're in some other part of the world, ideally you want to figure out what this is. You can ask your printer or somebody who's in charge. If they don't give you, I'll explain a bit later what you can do then. Now on the rendering intent here, I can choose between perceptual, relative colorimetric, and others. This basically tells you how you're going to map the colors which are outside of gamut, which cannot be printed, how you're going to squeeze them into whatever situation you're going to have for printing, right? So I'll choose that. And as far as simulate color and paper, if you don't have that on, well, simulate black ink controls gives you a preview of the dynamic range, in other words the contrast. And as you can see, if I activate this, what I'm immediately seeing inside the image is that I'm losing a lot of contrast. The image becomes more flat. This is because when you print, the dynamic range, the contrast that you can produce on paper is not going to be the one you can produce on screen. The screen one will always have more contrast. So in our case, we're going to lose some contrast. It's going to look a bit more flat. And this simulates that. Now simulate paper color, what it does, it simulates the color of white, the color of paper. Sometimes it's really white, sometimes it's more yellowish depending on the output. So with this I can simulate how the image might look when printed. However, this now looks really flat, especially because it was such a harsh transitions between before and after, right? So what I'll do, I'll click on the background and I'll choose this to custom. And this will give me now a white background, which is more similar to white. Now if you change this, let's say to black or to custom, what the problem is that the surrounding interface around the image affects how you see the contrast within the image. If it's black and we do our simulation of print, you can see just how much of the dynamic range we're losing, right? But if you change this to custom and set it to white, then if I preview before and after, it is not as bad. It doesn't seem as bad. So what other thing you can do if this looks way too harsh, you need to give your eyes a bit more time to adjust to the immediate change of the preview. So before you use the image as you see here, as it is in Photoshop. Switch this to white so that you have a proper, more contrast that looks more like paper. Now use your keyboard shortcut. In my case, that is for Command or Control Y or Command Z, depending on how you structured your keyboard shortcuts. Now step away, move your head to away from the monitor. Do your keyboard shortcut and activate the preview, and still don't look. Now look after a few seconds, and then you will see less of a dynamic change, which is going to give your eyes some time to adapt, and it's not going to look so bad, even though it's an accurate representation. So here we have a situation where we're simulating how the image might look when printed. And if I deactivate this preview now, so this is the way image was looking in Photoshop, this is when it's going to be printed. And what you see is that we're losing some contrast. So even if you add a bit more contrast, as long as you don't lose the details, if you add a little bit more contrast while you're working in Photoshop, and when you print that you will flatten out the image a little bit, then you can compensate for the fact that you have a bit more contrast on screen. On paper it's going to look better. So in our case it's going to look like this. Even though this looks horrible now and flat, the reason why this looks this way is because we're still viewing this in our monitor. But remember, when you view this on paper and there's a surrounding graphics and you're viewing this under some light in real world, it's not going to look as bad. So that's how you would kind of try to simulate how your image would look. And in this case we don't have any particular issues with out of gamut colors, and I can check that with activating the gamut warning. I don't see any. But if you had any out of gamut colors, then you would have to fix that. This is a bit of a bigger topic, and if there's some real interest for this, I'll create more videos. But basically sometimes it's not enough that you get the color you want. It's very important that you preserve that color, the appearance of color, when you print, because what's the point of spending all this time and figuring out color theory and color harmony? You know what colors work with what, you do all your editing inside of Photoshop, you get the colors you want, and then you go for print and it turns out something completely different, or you lose those colors, right? So that's something you have to worry about as well. That's why color management is all about managing the appearance of color, while color theory and color harmony and all that is what colors work with what. And of course then there's also a practical application of how do you get those colors to match inside of Photoshop. Alright, now let me give you another explanation about why I chose ECI RGB. Okay, and before I do that, let's talk about what happens if you don't know, for your proof setup, if you don't know what device to simulate, where are you going to send your file to print. If you don't know, then here's what I would suggest. Let me go back to a dark gray, which was original, and go to our original settings. If you don't know that, and if you don't have any really saturated color, and you might be also working, which is common with some people who have no idea about what color management is, then the best way to you're gonna sacrifice some color, but at least they're not gonna screw up your color when they print. Because the worst thing you can do is get a completely different image when it's printed. So in those cases, what I would do is I would convert this image when saving. I would go to Edit, and I would go to Convert to Profile, and if I know that this image will be printed, but I have no idea what the device will be for printing, and nobody wants to tell me, and I'm not sure that the people who are going to do the printing are color savvy, and they might screw up my color, then this what I'm about to show you is better than nothing, and it's going to preserve your color probably the best. And that is just like you would saving for web. You would convert this to sRGB. And as you can see, if I deactivate my preview, I'm going to lose some color in the background. You can see this area here, right? If I click preview, when I convert to sRGB, it's a smaller color space, so I'm going to sacrifice some color. But if I do that, it still image looks pretty much decent, right? It's not that bad. But when I do this, I will know for sure that when they print, the image will look the way I see on screen, almost positively. If I choose to leave this in ECI RGB or Adobe RGB and I save the file like that as a TIFF, I give that to people who are going to do the printing and they don't know what they're doing, they're gonna probably shift the color. I've seen that happen quite a few times. I would do all the work and then you send the file and they screw it up. So if you don't know, if you're skeptical, save in sRGB. If you know what you're doing and they know what they're doing, then either deliver the file as TIFF in ECI RGB or Adobe RGB. That should be plenty of everything they need in order to reproduce this and print properly. Now the thing I talked about, soft proofing, you could work with layers and everything the entire time by having your soft proofing on. And this will give you an idea how the image will print while you're working on it the entire time. Or you can just check at the end. But once again, ideally, you want to do a test print if you have that budget, if you have that luxury to really see the image printed side by side. Of course, on the proper light, maybe a print booth, and really compare the results. So here's another thing that you might ask, and that is, should you work in CMYK if you're doing it for print, or should you do it as a conversion at the end, or should you leave your printer or whatever to convert it to CMYK? My advice would be like this. If you know what the CMYK output would be and they ask you to deliver in CMYK, this is what I would do. I would work inside of RGB the entire time and just use soft proofing while I'm working so that I know what I'm getting. And then at the end, when I'm done, I would go to Edit, Convert to Profile, and I would choose a CMYK profile that I know they have given me. Let's say that's coded foreground 39, and I would flatten the image to preserve appearance at the end, and that's it. I would click to convert and deliver the CMYK. I would also probably deliver ECI version or Adobe RGB version of RGB as well, and that will be it. However, if they just tell you convert to CMYK, but they don't tell you what CMYK, then I would suggest that you try probably for a European market like Western Europe or something, probably foreground 39 might be a good choice to try. Or if you're for a if you're going for a United States, maybe like this US web coded swap 2. That's maybe another option you want to try, but generally speaking, you probably want to leave that to them, for them to take responsibility, or you want them to give you the proper information. So if you don't know and they won't tell you, maybe it's just better to deliver in Adobe or ECI RGB. And if you're saving for web, I have an entire video on that, so I'll link you to that as well. But here's what I would do. I would go to File. Actually, first I would reduce the file size, and so I would go to Image, I would go to Image, Duplicate, and I will click Duplicate Merge Layers Only. So I have a duplicate without any layers. I would go to Image, Image Size, and I would reduce this. I already told you for the web, I would either go for under width, either 1000, maybe 1200 for this type of landscape. If this was a portrait, maybe 700 pixels. And here on the resample, I would either choose bicubic sharper, which will reduce and add a bit of sharpening, and depending on the image, or I would use one of these other options. I'd like a bit of sharpening here, so I'll choose bicubic sharper, and I'll click OK. And now I'll just make it 100% here. And you can see it looks pretty good, right? Pretty clean, pretty nicely sharpened. And depending if I'm satisfied or not, I would sharpen it some more. And once I'm done that, now I will go to File, Save for Web. And here in the dialog box, I can see what's going to happen with my image. I would of course choose JPEG here. on the presets. I can choose either very high or maybe even 80% is in most cases pretty good. You can see the preview of rendition here. You can also see what the file size will be down here, and pretty much everything else is set, except you want to make sure that it's optimized, set on, embedded color profile is on, that's very important, and that you say convert to sRGB. So probably the two most important checkboxes are convert to sRGB and embedded color profile every time you're saving for web. And I will click save. And that will be pretty much it. That's how I would then prepare the file. And of course, as I already mentioned, if it's for print, then I would deliver in JPEG, 8-bit, sRGB. About 1200, 1000, or 700 pixels wide, depending on the landscape, portrait image, and so on. If I'm delivering for print, if I don't know what the output will be for print and I don't know what they're going to do with it, then I would deliver TIFF, 8-bit, and sRGB as a color profile, so that I minimize the potential problems in color. If, however, I am sure that they will do a nice job, then I would deliver for print TIFF, 8-bit, and here I would either choose ECI RGB or Adobe RGB. And if they want me to convert it to a CMYK, then of course I would go to edit and convert to profile and choose appropriate CMYK profile. That's how I would prepare the file, and then use WeTransfer, FTP server, or whatever you want to deliver the actual file to the client. Okay guys, so it's Halloween, so I wanted to show you a bit of a treat here. I wanted to show you a kind of like a 3D representation of what's going on with our colors, so you get a better sense of what's going on. Okay, so let's start with showing you this. This is known as spectrum locus, and basically represents human vision plotted in 2D in a horse shape. And if you compare that with a very large color space like ProPhoto that we see here, ProPhoto RGB is so big, in fact, that partly it's outside what we are able to see. So it's the biggest color space. It goes beyond most monitors and everything else, even our vision. So why would we need such a huge color space? Well, the idea is to use it almost as a warehouse, almost as a place where you store your color so you don't lose it. So for example, if you shot your image as a RAW file, the color profile is not yet set in RAW file. You have to set it inside of your Camera Raw or whatever you're using as a converter. However, when you open up an image inside of Camera Raw, you still haven't lost your color. You are working with a modified version of this huge color space called ProPhoto. In Lightroom it's called Melissa RGB, but it's basically a modified version of this. And the idea is that you have whatever color your camera was able to capture, you can manipulate it within the raw file. However, we seen our workflow options we have to choose when we're going to open it up inside of Photoshop. And we had different options. Well, there are some common options. So let me deactivate the spectrum locus and let's just focus on the ProPhoto. So one option was to use ProPhoto and open it inside of Photoshop. Why would you want to do that? Well, if you have a lot of saturated colors and you're going to do some really tricky color correction, maybe if you do, and you're going to print on a wide gamut, something like inkjet printer, and you have a wide gamut monitor, then this makes sense. Otherwise, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the other option for many is sRGB or Adobe RGB, right? So let's take a look. This is Adobe RGB, and you can see it's somewhat smaller but still pretty decent in size. And the one below it is sRGB, which is a lot smaller. So which one should you choose, and why would you want to choose it? Well, let's deactivate sRGB and let's deactivate Adobe RGB and focus only on ProPhoto. Well, remember, if we are sending this to print, then we have to think in terms of our output. And what our output is will be, well, let's say we're going to print on somewhere in Europe and it's going to be on coated full grade 39 ink and paper combination. And as you can see, this is the size of what we're able to print in terms of color. And it's quite a bit smaller, right? So what you want to do is that when you go from this large color space that you use in your camera raw, and you go in Photoshop, and you know you're going to print on this a lot smaller color space, you want to make sure that you don't lose any color in between. So what happens if I go from this large color space in camera raw, and I know I'm going to print on this smaller one, and in between I choose sRGB as my output? Well, what I can see is that sRGB is larger in some areas, like blues here and magentas, but not so in yellows and in greens and blues. Now we remember we had a lot of blues and some greenish type colors in our image, so that would be something we would lose, right? So sRGB wouldn't be a good choice here. What about Adobe RGB? Well, if I choose Adobe RGB, that's a bit larger space which can fit the foreground 39 pretty much in its entirety. So that will be a good choice. What about ECI? Well, ECI is even bigger slightly than Adobe RGB and completely covers what our output will be. So that's a perfect choice, right? So let me show you for our purposes why I chose ECI RGB. I will deactivate Pro Photo and I'm going to activate ECI. And you can see it's big enough to fit all the colors we will need for our final output, and it's not as big as Pro Photo, so it's dangerous to work because you don't even know what you're doing. You're working half blind because you're manipulating colors you can't see on your monitor, you can't even see on your eyes sometimes, so it's a bit of a tricky situation. That's why Adobe or RGB or ECI are more manageable, somewhat, you know, similar color spaces which are medium size, good for this kind of work. Let me show you this in 3D now. And let me take the ECI and reduce the opacity of it so you can see the one in smaller inside. And you can see that comfortably the entire ECI encompasses all the things we might use in our printer. But what about our image? What about our image actually? Not the intended color space, but our image. So let's compare that. But first, before I go into that, let me deactivate our ECI and our foreground 39, and let's compare Adobe RGB with ECI now. And let's put this in 3D. And the one larger one, that's ECI, and the smaller one, slightly smaller one, is Adobe RGB. And as you can see, they're very similar, where ECI favors, it's slightly better, is in certain skin tones, a bit on the greens and slightly in the magentas. So if you have those colors inside the image and you know your output, you know, for, like I said, for North America, Adobe RGB is usually a good option. For Europe, Western Europe, I typically use ECI RGB. However, depending on your output, you know, it also have to consider your image and what your output would be. So let's take a look at this with an image. I'll go to 2D again. I'm going to deactivate Adobe RGB and I'm going to just show you ECI RGB. Okay. Now this is the one we opened up the image inside of Photoshop. Now let's take a look at our actual image. Okay. And this is the colors within our image. If you remember all those blues and greens in our background and sky, ocean, and then our skin tones. And if I see this in 3D, what you'll see is that our ECI covers everything, all the colors within the image. But what about if we print this image? Right, what about if we print this image? Now remember, let me open up Photoshop for a moment. You can see that these greens here and blues and all of these skin tones, well, those are contained within our image. Right here we can see them. All of these blues and then greens a little bit and those skin tones. Well, let's say we want to print this on a foreground 39 the way it is now. I'm going to open up a foreground 39 here. Let me see. Give it a moment to render, and then you'll see how our image will look if it was printed in that paper and in combination foreground 39. Now it's trying to calculate all the colors and everything, so it might take a little bit of while. By the way, I'm using a ColorThink Pro version 3. That's the program I'm using to show you this. and it's a great program if you want to analyze color and different color profiles and things like that. So there we go, and I'm gonna click on our coded foreground 39, and I'm gonna just reduce the opacity so you can see better. So here you see our image inside the profile where which is we're going to use for print. And here's one thing you see. If I show it you like this, you can see that some of the really bright colors, our highlights, are not going to be able to print because the dynamic range, the contrast of the paper presented by this shape is smaller than what we can see on our monitor here, right? So when we print something, we are going to lose some contrast. And the same is true for some of the blacks here. You can see namely these blacks here, right? You can see kind of like these blacks here, which represent the hair. They're not going to be printed, and some of the highlights are not going to be printed. We can see that clearly here. And in fact, if I go to Photoshop, and I'm going to show you the simulated version, if you remember. So this is when it's printed. This is the original inside of RGB. This is when it's printed, and you can see how we are not able to print those deep, rich blacks as well as those deep whites. And that's exactly shown here, right? We have our smaller foreground 39, and we're not going to be able to print some of these colors here, and we're not going to be able to print some of these colors at the top, these really bright highlights. And if I showed you this in 2D, you wouldn't be able to see that we won't print some of those colors, right? So it has to be a 3D example so you can see. But what about if we change this to sRGB? Well, let me deactivate our color. Let me deactivate our coded foreground 39, and let me compare this now with sRGB so you can see what's going on. So this is now sRGB, right? And sRGB should fit most of the colors we are I'm showing you the ECI RGB, which fits all the colors. What I really wanted to show you is sRGB. And when I show you sRGB, what you can see is that it's just too small. So for our image, we're going to lose some blues here. You can see it here, right? Just some sticking out blues. And those are some of the colors we have in our image. So if we work in sRGB, we're going to lose those colors. And we can, in fact, print them, because if you remember, if I open up coded foreground 39, it's bigger than sRGB, so those colors can, in fact, be printed. But if we worked in sRGB, then we couldn't print those colors. And once again, I'll show you this in our actual image. So this is the image, currently in ECI RGB, and I'll go to Edit, Convert to Profile, and here I'll choose sRGB. And look at those greens that we cannot print. You see here and here. Let me show you. See how they're gonna be clipped. This is because sRGB is smaller in those areas than our intended output, as well as the color that we have inside the image. And if we go back to this example, you can see, so this is sRGB compared to our image, and those are the colors we would clip if we chose sRGB as our working profile. But instead, if we choose a bigger one like ECI, then we don't have that issue. We can contain all the colors until they're finally ready to print. And when they're ready to print, our image is going to end up in foreground 39, which is going to print pretty much all the colors. Maybe few specks of blue here won't, but what we will definitely lose is, in fact, some deep shadows we saw at the bottom, and some whites. And this is because the dynamic range of the paper, or the contrast of the paper, is just smaller than the one we have on our monitor. And if I show you this in an actual image, yeah, we don't lose much in the way of color, maybe a few blues in there, but what we do lose is contrast. dynamic range. That's why I suggested we use a white background so we don't see that change as dramatically. And that's why I would use ECI for my work. Now what about Adobe RGB? Well, let me show you that. What if I, instead of ECI here, I would, let's say I use Adobe RGB, right? So let me show you. This is Adobe RGB now compared to our image, and what you can see is that indeed all the colors would fit in this, right? So what's the difference? Well, if I compare, let me actually change this to a single color. So red will be our Adobe RGB, and I'm going to use it as a wireframe. And for a, I'm going to compare it to ECI RGB, right? And what you can see is that actually maybe change the color of our Adobe to something that's going to be much more visible, maybe blue. And here you can see, so this is image inside, and then we have comparison of Adobe RGB and ECI, and what you see is that they're both big enough to fit this image. They're both very similar. ECI favors a bit colors in the skin tones and a bit blues and greens, so that's the way it's a bit bigger. But let me show you something else. I'll go to 2D for this. I'll deactivate our image because I want to show you something really different. If I know that I'm going to print this on coated FOGRAD 39, and if I were to print this now inside of Adobe, if I were to use Adobe RGB, you can see that Adobe RGB is big enough to fit the entire FOGRAD 39 print inside, except in one area. And if I see this in 3D, you can see what that area is. And those are some of the colors that might fit into the sky area, those blues, right? But if instead of Adobe RGB I use ECI RGB, well, ECI is just big enough for everything. So if I change this to blue and, sorry, wireframe, you can see. So ECI is more than enough to fit the entire FOGRAD 39 as well as the colors within the image itself. And that's why I use ECI for FOGRAD 39 or European-based printing. If you're inside of United States and you're printing on a different paper and ink combination, Adobe RGB in 99.9% of the cases is going to be pretty good. And I sometimes alternate between the two depending on my output. Hopefully this covers what you now can better understand why I chose one color over the other. Hopefully I didn't go too fast, but you can follow this along. See you in the next one. Thank you for watching, and if you see any videos that you like on my channel, please give me a thumbs up, click the like button, share it if you like with your friends, spread the word, leave a comment, give me some feedback so I can make better videos. And if you like to receive more videos that I upload and get a up-to-date state on my channel and the tutorials I make, please click on the subscribe button. And here's a really interesting thing I would also recommend. You see this little icon here, this little wheel? If you click on it, there's an option called Send Me Updates, and you click just Save. That way you will get updates to your directly to your inbox in your email, not just on the channel update, and you will never miss a video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.